Now that Chapter 4 has been out for a couple months, I'm wondering, when will Chapter 5 be released? Because with the release of Chapter 4 being a little bit rushed, it seems like they might delay Chapter 5 in order to get everything right before release. Well, let's go over each of the release dates, as well as the feedback from the community to see when Chapter 5 will be released. Chapter 1 was released on October 12th, 2021. Chapter 2 was released on May 5th, 2022, one day after my birthday. Chapter 3 was released on January 30th, 2024, and Chapter 4 was released on January 30th, 2025. In between Chapters 1 and 2, there was only about a 7-month gap. But the thing is, it's even crazier when you realize that they probably didn't expect their game to be this much of a hit. So to create a second chapter so fast is actually a little surprising. But between Chapters 2 and 3, there was a huge gap for about a year and 7 months, making it the largest gap in the series. And the reason for this is most likely because of Project Playtime, which was a game that Mob tried to make in between chapters, similar to other games like Dead by Daylight. But the game ended up flopping pretty hard, as in the beginning it seemed to be doing well, but with the lack of updates and eventually the game being completely abandoned, it seems like it was a waste of Mob's efforts. But then when we see the 1-year gap between Chapter 3 and 4, it doesn't seem rushed when you take into account that Mob literally made an entire other game in between Chapters 2 and 3. And yet, Chapter 3 was probably the best chapter in the series. So having a full year to work on Chapter 4, it seems like they were going about an average pace. But with Chapter 4 being rushed and coming out with a lot of bugs that made the game hard to play, then you can see that Mob is definitely gonna learn from their lesson and take their time with Chapter 5. Release day is when most players are gonna play the game, either to avoid spoilers or so that they can play one of their favorite games that they've been waiting for so long to release. But with the Yarnaby boss fights being the hardest thing in my entire life and Harley Sawyer's death being the most confusing thing of my life, then it makes sense as to why the game didn't perform as well as it should have. And if we look at the story, we can see that we're now completely alone in the bottom of the factory, with everybody being dead or not on our side, except for Kissy, and we don't even know whether or not she's still alive. And so with Ollie revealed to be the prototype, Poppy betraying us, Kissy Missy possibly being dead, us figuring out that Huggy's still alive, and being in the highest clearance place in the entire factory, it makes sense that Chapter 5 is gonna be the end. We'll most likely explore the labs, which is also known as the prototype's home, where we'll possibly defeat him or maybe even get an ending where the prototype would win, which would leave us all shocked. And so with all of this being said, it really depends on how much workforce that Mob has nowadays. Since Chapter 5 is probably gonna be the last chapter, then they're probably gonna make it the best chapter out of all of them, because if they end the series strong, then whatever game they work on next, they'll have a good reputation and be more likely to make more sales on that game, which might end up being a spin-off of Poppy Playtime or could be a new game entirely. But a lot rests on the reputation of how well they'll make the final chapter of Poppy Playtime, which means that they're going to be extremely motivated to make the last chapter the best chapter and make sure that there are absolutely no bugs before release. So if they work on it about the same pace as they did with Chapter 4, then Chapter 5 would most likely be coming out sometime in the middle of 2026. And although this sounds like an extremely long time, it's probably going to be worth the wait with how good it could be. Or if they manage to work on it super hard and they want to keep the pattern of releasing every January 30th, then it is entirely possible that they'll end up releasing the game on January 30th of 2026. But then again, with it probably being the final chapter and Chapter 4 getting a lot of backlash, they're probably gonna take their time with this one. But what's interesting is the fact that Mob likes to foreshadow what's gonna come in the next chapter in the previous chapter. For example, in a Chapter 3 tape, we hear a scientist trying to talk about Kevin, who was one of the Doughy children, but then got interrupted by one of Kevin's friends. And then we see the continuation of that exact same same tape in chapter 4. And so the reason I bring this up is because one of the notes describes an interaction with one of the toys in Safe Haven and the prototype. He was just staring at the glass, tapping on it, inspiring fear in the Safe Haven toys. But in the notes, he describes the prototype's face as being horrifying. And so if they follow the same trend of foreshadowing chapters before one another, then it's possible that in chapter 5, we'll finally get to see what the prototype's face looks like. And another thing that we have to take into consideration is just how much time animation probably takes. Because although building a game is hard, making all of the cutscenes is probably just as hard, if not even harder, because they have to make all of the movement look realistic without any clipping or bugs. And with the prototype's lower half being absolutely massive, as we saw in the silhouette in chapter 4, then animating the prototype in chapter 5, if he does end up appearing, is probably going to take a huge chunk of time. Especially if chapter 5 is going to be the last chapter, then they're going to spend a lot of time on different cutscenes and making sure that they're animated properly. Because if the factory ends up exploding, then that's going to be a huge, massive cutscene. But if there's going to be a big boss fight, then there might even be more cutscenes similar to the one with Dowie in the end of chapter 4.
You and Poppy! It's all your fault! We're to kill you! Can't trust anyone! The gentle voices lie! You lie!
Or the one where the prototype kills Catnap in the end of chapter 3. And so with all of these things coming into play for chapter 5, it seems like they're going to take a lot more than a year, probably a year and a half. Or if they have a larger workforce or work more hours, then they might be able to finish the game quicker. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and click on this video right here.